The lunch tray clattered to the floor as 16-year-old Alex Parker watched the cafeteria lady's eyes transform. For just 3 seconds, Margaret Chen's gentle expression vanished, replaced by something that made Alex's spine freeze. When that aggressive student had grabbed the serving spoon and swung it toward another kid, Maggie hadn't just reacted, she had calculated. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Alex saw her eyes track the arc of motion, assess the distance, measure the angle, all while her hand moved with surgical precision to intercept the improvised weapon. The incident was over before anyone else even noticed, but Alex caught something. In that brief moment that didn't belong to someone who served mashed potatoes for a living. The morning sun filtered through the industrial windows of Lincoln High School's cafeteria, casting long shadows across the stainless steel prep stations where Margaret Chen had already been working for 2 hours. At 51, she moved through the kitchen with a methodical precision that her colleagues attributed to 4 years of perfecting the breakfast routine. Her graying hair was pulled back in a practical bun, secured with the same hairnet that 23 other food service workers wore, and her navy uniform bore the simple nameplate that read Maggie in block letters. To the 2,800 students who passed through her serving line each day, she was simply the quiet Asian woman who always gave them extra fruit when they looked tired, who remembered their names after the 3rd interaction, and who somehow managed to keep the hash browns consistently crispy despite the ancient equipment. Teachers knew her as the employee who arrived before dawn and stayed past her scheduled shift, ensuring that dietary restrictions were properly accommodated and that no student went hungry. Regardless of their lunch account balance, Margaret's efficiency was legendary among the kitchen staff. She could portion 300 servings of chili in the time it took others to complete 200. Her knife work while preparing vegetables was so precise that Carol Martinez, the head of food services, often joked that Maggie had missed her calling as a chef. When new equipment arrived, Maggie somehow instinctively understood its operation, without consulting manuals. During the chaotic lunch rushes, she maintained a calm presence that steadied the entire team. What none of them understood was that Margaret's efficiency came from a different kind of training altogether. The way she positioned herself at the serving station wasn't random. It provided clear sightlines to all entrances and exit routes. Her habit of arriving early wasn't dedication to the job, but an unconscious need to assess the environment before others arrived. The precision of her knife work came from years of training where millimeters mattered between success and catastrophe. 4 years earlier, Margaret had walked away from a world where her call sign was Phantom 6, where she could place a bullet through a target the size of a quarter from 800 meters, where her mission reports were sealed at classification, levels that most military personnel would never access. The transition from that life to Lincoln High School's cafeteria hadn't been accidental. It had been deliberate, calculated, and necessary. The breakfast shift proceeded with its usual rhythm. Margaret worked alongside Jenny Patterson, a chatty 20-something who provided running commentary about her weekend adventures, and Roberto Santos, a grandfather of 6 who treated every student like family. Their easy camaraderie was something Margaret had learned to appreciate. The simple pleasure of working with people whose biggest concerns involved menu planning and equipment maintenance rather than life and death decisions made in hostile territories. As students began filtering in for early breakfast, Margaret fell into the familiar routine of serving, smiling, and engaging in brief conversations that never revealed anything significant about her past. To freshman Marcus, she was the lady who always made sure he got 2 breakfast burritos because she'd noticed how thin he was. To senior Priya, she was the adult who asked about her college applications and listened with genuine interest. 2. The scattered groups of teenagers who formed the daily breakfast crowd. She was background reliable, kind, and completely unremarkable. Principal Robert Williams made his usual morning rounds, stopping by the cafeteria to check on operations before the main rush began. He exchanged pleasantries with Carol Martinez about the upcoming school board meeting and complimented the kitchen staff on their efficiency. When he reached Margaret's station, their interaction was brief and professional, as it had been for 4 years. What Williams didn't mention was the way he'd started watching Margaret more carefully over the past few months. It wasn't anything obvious, just small details that didn't quite fit the profile of a career food service worker. The way she scanned rooms when she entered them, how she positioned herself during conversations to maintain visual awareness of her surroundings, her unconscious habit of calculating distances and angles, even during mundane tasks. As a former military police officer himself, Williams recognized behaviors that suggested training beyond what Margaret's employment file indicated. Her application had been straightforward: previous food service experience, excellent references, and a background check that revealed nothing unusual. Yet something about her demeanor suggested capabilities that extended far beyond operating industrial kitchen equipment. The breakfast period ended with its typical controlled chaos. Students hurried to first period while kitchen staff began preparing for the larger lunch service. Margaret moved seamlessly between tasks, helping to load the industrial dishwashers, organizing ingredients for the day's menu, and ensuring that all health code requirements were meticulously followed. During the brief lull between breakfast and lunch prep, she allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. Through the serving window, she could see students heading to classes, teachers carrying coffee cups and lesson plans, and the general bustle of a school day beginning. This world of schedules and standardized tests, of teenage drama and academic achievement, had become her sanctuary. Here, the most complex decisions involved menu modifications for food allergies and managing inventory supplies. Problems had clear solutions, success was measured in satisfied students and efficient service, and nobody asked questions about classified operations or military service records that officially didn't exist. Margaret had chosen this life specifically because it offered everything her previous career had lacked: predictability, safety, and the absence of moral complexity. After 15 years of making decisions where the wrong choice could result in international incidents or lost lives, the cafeteria provided blessed simplicity. Yet as she began preparing vegetables for the lunch service, something nagged at her consciousness. William's attention hadn't gone unnoticed, and after years of operational awareness, she trusted her instincts when they suggested increased scrutiny. The carefully constructed normalcy she'd built might not remain intact much longer. The incident happened during the height of lunch service on a Tuesday that had started like any other. Margaret was stationed at her usual position behind the serving counter, ladling portions of chicken teriyaki over rice while maintaining the steady rhythm that kept the line moving efficiently. The cafeteria buzzed with its typical energy: 600 students rotating through during the 45-minute lunch period, creating a controlled chaos of conversations, laughter, and the constant clatter of trays and utensils. Alex Parker approached her station carrying a lunch tray that already held a wilted salad from the vegetable bar. The 17-year-old junior had always been observant, the kind of student who noticed details that others missed, who preferred watching people rather than being the center of attention. Something about Margaret had caught Alex's interest over the past year, not in a concerning way, but with the curiosity of someone who sensed there was more to the quiet cafeteria worker than met the eye. "The usual, Alex?" Margaret asked with the warm smile she perfected for student interactions. She knew that Alex preferred the teriyaki with extra vegetables and always declined the offered dinner roll. "Yes, ma'am, thank you," Alex replied, then hesitated. "Mrs. Chen, can I ask you something?" Margaret's hand paused for just a fraction of a second as she reached for the serving spoon. Students rarely initiated conversations beyond menu preferences, and questions usually involved scheduling or dietary restrictions. Of course, yesterday. During the fire drill, I noticed you were the first person to know exactly where all the exits were. Like, without even thinking about it. Have you worked in a lot of schools? The question was innocent enough, but Margaret felt her internal alert system activate. Alex's tone suggested genuine curiosity rather than suspicion, yet the observation revealed more awareness than she'd expected from any student. I believe in being prepared, she replied carefully, adding the requested extra vegetables to Alex's plate. Safety is important in a workplace. Alex nodded but continued watching Margaret's face with the kind of attention that made her uncomfortable. It's just interesting how you always seem to know things. Like last month when that 8th grader was choking. You knew exactly what to do before any of the teachers even realized what was happening. Margaret's smile remained steady, but internally. She was assessing. The Heimlich maneuver incident had been instinctive years of medical. Training had kicked in automatically when she'd seen the student's distress. She'd acted without thinking, dislodging the obstruction quickly and efficiently, then stepped back as school personnel took over. At the time, she'd hoped her response would be attributed to basic first aid knowledge that any responsible adult might possess. I took a CPR class when I started working here, Margaret said, which was technically true, though it represented perhaps 1% of her actual medical training. Everyone should know basic emergency procedures. Before Alex could respond, a commotion erupted near the beverage station. 2 students, a hulking senior named Derek, who'd been in trouble multiple times for aggressive behavior, and a smaller sophomore named Kevin, were engaged in what appeared to be a heated argument over who had been in line first. Their voices rose above the general cafeteria noise, drawing attention from nearby tables. Margaret's awareness shifted instantly into operational mode. She assessed the situation in the time it took most people to turn their heads toward the disturbance. Derek outweighed Kevin by at least 60 pounds and had a history of using his size to intimidate other students. Kevin, despite being smaller, showed signs of escalating anger rather than backing down, a combination that experience told Margaret would likely result in physical confrontation. The nearest supervising teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, was positioned approximately 30 feet away and dealing with a spilled tray incident. Detective Tommy Rodriguez, the school's resource officer, was nowhere visible in the immediate area. Security. Cameras would capture whatever happened, but wouldn't prevent it. Margaret began moving before the situation fully escalated, her steps measured and purposeful. To observers, she appeared to be walking normally, but her pace and path were calculated to position her within intervention range. Just as the confrontation reached its critical point, Derek shoved Kevin hard enough to send the smaller student stumbling backward into a table of freshman girls, causing their drinks to splash across the surface. The girls screamed and jumped back as Kevin regained his balance, his face flushed with humiliation and rage. Several students began pulling out phones to record what they expected would become a fight, while others started backing away to create a viewing circle. "Hey," Derek yelled, jabbing his finger toward Kevin's chest. "You think you can just cut in line because you're some kind of honor student? This isn't the library, genius." Kevin's hands clenched into fists despite the obvious size disadvantage. "I was here first, and everyone saw it. Just because you're bigger doesn't mean you get to take whatever you want." Margaret reached the optimal position just as Derek's demeanor shifted from verbal aggression to physical preparation. She recognized the telltale signs, weight shifting to the balls of his feet, shoulders squaring, hands moving away from his sides. Years of studying human behavior in high-stress situations had taught her to read these indicators with near-perfect accuracy. What happened next occurred so quickly that most observers would later disagree about the exact sequence of events. Derek drew back his right arm to throw a punch at Kevin's face, a swing that would have likely resulted in significant injury given the size disparity. Margaret stepped forward and intercepted Derek's wrist with her left hand while simultaneously positioning herself between the two students. The intervention appeared deceptively simple, just a cafeteria worker preventing a fight between students. But Alex, watching from the serving line, saw something different. Margaret's movement had been precise to the millimeter, timing perfectly, calculated to intercept Derek's swing at the exact moment when his momentum could be redirected with minimal force. Her grip on his wrist, while appearing gentle, had clearly immobilized his entire arm. Most remarkably, her positioning had been achieved without any apparent hurry or dramatic gestures. "Derek, take a deep breath," Margaret said calmly, her voice carrying an authority that seemed to surprise the large student. "Kevin, step back please. This doesn't need to escalate." Derek tried to pull his arm free and discovered that Margaret's grip, despite her small stature, was immovable. His expression shifted from anger to confusion as he realized that a woman who barely reached his shoulders was somehow controlling his movement entirely. "Let go of me," Derek demanded, but his voice lacked the aggression of moments before. Something in Margaret's steady gaze suggested that resistance would be inadvisable. "When you're calm," Margaret replied evenly. "Both of you are better than this, and you both know it. Derek, you don't need to intimidate people to get respect. Kevin, walking away from confrontation isn't weakness, it's wisdom." Detective Rodriguez appeared at Margaret's shoulder, having been summoned by students who'd alerted him to the disturbance. "Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." "Everything under control here, Mrs. Chen." Margaret released Derek's wrist and stepped back, allowing the detective to position himself between the two students. "Just a misunderstanding that got a little heated," she said. "I think both young men are ready to move on with their day." As Rodriguez began speaking with Derek and Kevin, Margaret returned to her serving station, where Alex was still waiting with a partially filled tray, watching her with undisguised fascination. "That was amazing," Alex said quietly. "How did you know exactly what to do?" Margaret resumed serving as if nothing unusual had occurred. "Experience with teenage behavior," she replied, though the answer felt inadequate even to her. "When you work around young people long enough, you learn to recognize when situations are getting out of hand." But Alex's expression suggested skepticism. "The way you moved, though. That wasn't just experience. That was training, like serious training." Before Margaret could respond, Principal Williams approached the serving counter. He'd observed the entire incident from across the cafeteria and had reached the same conclusion as Alex. Margaret's intervention had demonstrated capabilities that extended far beyond typical conflict resolution skills. "Mrs. Chen," Williams said, his tone carefully neutral, "thank you for handling that situation so effectively. Could I speak with you privately when your shift ends today, in my office?" Margaret met his gaze directly, recognizing the careful way he'd phrased the request. It wasn't really a request at all, but a politely worded summons. After 4 years of successfully maintaining her cover, something had shifted in the careful balance of her hidden existence. "Of course, Principal Williams," she replied. "I'll stop by around 3:30. As Williams walked away and Alex reluctantly moved along the serving line, Margaret continued her lunch duties with practiced efficiency. But internally, she was already assessing options and preparing for questions she'd hoped never to face. The simple life she'd constructed at Lincoln High School was about to become significantly more complicated. The remainder of the lunch period passed without incident, but Margaret was acutely aware of increased attention from both students and staff members who'd witnessed or heard about the confrontation. Mrs. Patterson, her usual chatty coworker, seemed unusually quiet, stealing glances at Margaret when she thought she wasn't looking. Even Roberto, normally focused entirely on his own tasks, appeared to be studying her with new curiosity. During the post-lunch cleanup, Carol Martinez approached Margaret with an expression that mixed concern with professional interest. "That thing with Derek and Kevin," Carol began, wiping down the serving counter with more attention than necessary. "I've been doing this job for 12 years, and I've never seen anyone handle a potential fight quite like that. Where'd you learn to do that?" Margaret kept her focus on organizing the serving utensils for the industrial dishwasher. "Just instinct, I suppose. Derek's really not a bad kid, he just gets frustrated sometimes." "That's not what I mean," Carol pressed gently. "The way you moved, positioned yourself, controlled the situation. That looked like professional training to me." The conversation Margaret had been dreading for 4 years was finally beginning, initiated not by administrative scrutiny, but by the genuine curiosity of colleagues who'd worked alongside her daily. She realized that her careful maintenance of an unremarkable profile had been compromised by a single moment of acting according to her true nature rather than her constructed persona. "I've always been good with people," Margaret said, which was both true and completely inadequate as an explanation. "Sometimes you just know how to read a situation." Carol nodded, but her expression suggested she wasn't entirely satisfied with the response. As the kitchen staff finished their cleanup duties and prepared for the afternoon break, Margaret felt the weight of accumulated attention and unasked questions. The incident with Derek and Kevin had been a catalyst, but Alex's observations suggested that her cover had been slowly eroding for some time. Walking toward Principal Williams' office at 3:30, Margaret mentally prepared for a conversation that could change everything. She'd spent 4 years building a life based on simplicity and anonymity, but a single moment of instinctive action had potentially exposed the carefully buried truth about who she really was. Principal Williams' office occupied a corner of the administrative building with windows that provided a clear view of the main parking lot and the street beyond. Margaret noticed these details automatically as she knocked on the doorframe, though Williams had left the door open in anticipation of her arrival. The office walls displayed the typical collection of educational awards, student artwork, and photographs from school events that marked it as belonging to a career educator who genuinely cared about his institution. "Mrs. Chen, please come in and have a seat," Williams said, gesturing toward one of the 2 chairs positioned in front of his desk. His tone was professional but not unfriendly, suggesting this would be a conversation rather than an interrogation. Nevertheless, Margaret remained alert as she settled into the indicated chair, her posture relaxed but ready. Williams closed the door quietly before taking his own seat, a gesture that immediately elevated the meeting's significance. In Margaret's experience, closed-door conversations in administrative offices rarely involved routine workplace matters. She maintained her composed expression while internally cataloging exit routes and assessing whether Williams represented a genuine threat to her carefully constructed identity. "I want to start by saying that you've been an exemplary employee," Williams began, opening a personnel file that Margaret recognized as her own. 4 years of perfect attendance, consistently positive evaluations from Carol Martinez, and no complaints from students or parents. In fact, the feedback has been overwhelmingly positive. Margaret nodded politely, waiting for the direction this conversation would take. Compliments typically preceded more difficult discussions, especially when delivered with the careful precision Williams was demonstrating. However, Williams continued, "Today's incident with Derek Thompson and Kevin Walsh raised some questions that I think we should address directly." He leaned back in his chair, studying Margaret's face with the kind of attention she associated with trained investigators. "The way you handled that situation was unusual." "I simply prevented 2 students from making a mistake they would have regretted," Margaret replied calmly. Derek was clearly upset, and Kevin was too proud to back down. Sometimes adults need to intervene before things escalate. Williams nodded slowly. "That's true, and your intervention was appropriate. But Mrs. Chen, I spent 8 years in military police before becoming an educator. I've seen trained personnel handle violent confrontations, and what you did today looked like textbook de-escalation technique combined with precise physical control. The conversation had reached the territory Margaret had hoped to avoid. Williams' military background explained his increased attention over recent months, and his trained eye had recognized behaviors that civilian administrators might have overlooked. She maintained her neutral expression while rapidly calculating response options. "I took some self-defense classes years ago," Margaret said, which was technically accurate, though it represented perhaps 0.1% of her actual training. "When you work with teenagers, it seems like a reasonable precaution." "I'm sure it does," Williams agreed, but his tone suggested he wasn't convinced by her explanation. "The thing is, Mrs. Chen, those self-defense classes must have been quite comprehensive. The way you positioned yourself to control Derek's movement while simultaneously creating space between him and Kevin, that showed tactical awareness that goes beyond basic personal protection training." Margaret felt the familiar tension that preceded exposure, the heightened alertness that years of covert operations had ingrained as a survival mechanism. Williams was clearly building toward a more direct confrontation, and her options were becoming increasingly limited. She could continue deflecting his questions, but his military background meant he would likely recognize evasion tactics. "Principal Williams," Margaret said carefully, "I'm not sure what you're implying. I saw 2 students about to make a serious mistake, and I prevented it using the most efficient method available. If my response seemed unusual, perhaps it's because most people hesitate when action is required." Williams smiled slightly, the expression of someone who recognized a skillful non-answer. "That's exactly what I mean, Mrs. Chen. Most people do hesitate, even trained personnel. But you didn't hesitate at all. You assessed the situation, calculated the optimal intervention point, and executed a response that neutralized the threat while minimizing risk to everyone involved." The specificity of his language was troubling. Williams wasn't simply asking about her background, he was demonstrating knowledge of tactical terminology that suggested he understood exactly what kind of training produced the responses he'd observed. "You're making this sound much more complicated than it was," Margaret replied. "I saw a potential problem and addressed it. That's what responsible adults do." "Of course," Williams said, opening her personnel file and reviewing the top page. "According to your employment application, you worked in food service for several restaurants in California before moving to Phoenix." The references checked out. Your background investigation was clean, and your interview demonstrated excellent qualifications for the position. Margaret waited, sensing that Williams was approaching the real purpose of their meeting. "But here's what's interesting," Williams continued. "Yesterday, I decided to do some additional research into your background. Not because I suspected anything inappropriate, but because I was curious about where you'd developed the skills I've been observing." Margaret's internal alarm system escalated to high alert. If Williams had conducted an investigation beyond the standard employment verification, he might have discovered inconsistencies in her constructed identity. The false background had been professionally created and designed to withstand routine scrutiny, but determined investigation by someone with the right access could potentially reveal gaps. "I hope you found everything in order," Margaret said evenly. "Actually, that's the fascinating part," Williams replied. "I found exactly what someone would find if they were looking for Margaret Chen, former restaurant worker from California. Employment records, tax filings, even a few photographs from company events. Everything perfectly documented and completely verifiable." Margaret maintained her composure while internally analyzing the implications of Williams' statement. His tone suggested that he'd found her cover identity convincing, but the way he'd phrased his discovery indicated he understood it was a construction rather than genuine history. "I'm not sure I understand your point," Margaret said. Williams closed the file and leaned forward slightly. "Mrs. Chen, I've been an educator for 15 years, and before that I spent 8 years in military police. In that time, I've learned to recognize when someone has training that extends far beyond their apparent background. I've also learned to appreciate when someone chooses to use exceptional skills in service of protecting others. The conversation had shifted into territory that Margaret hadn't anticipated. Williams seemed to be acknowledging her hidden background while simultaneously indicating that he had no intention of exposing it. She remained silent, waiting to understand his actual purpose. What I observed today, Williams continued, was someone with advanced tactical training choosing to use those skills to protect students, rather than pursuing whatever career that training originally prepared her for. That suggests someone who has deliberately chosen service over personal advancement. Margaret realized that Williams was offering her an opportunity to acknowledge her background without requiring specific admissions. His military experience had given him insight into the kinds of career transitions that led highly trained personnel into civilian roles where their skills remained hidden but available when needed. Principal Williams, Margaret said carefully, I've always believed that protecting young people is everyone's responsibility. If my response today seemed more effective than usual, I'm glad it prevented anyone from being hurt. So am I, Williams replied with genuine warmth. And that's actually why I wanted to speak with you privately. Mrs. Chen, this school serves 2,800 students in a neighborhood where violence is unfortunately common. We do our best to provide a safe learning environment, but we can't eliminate every risk. Margaret began to understand where this conversation was heading. Williams wasn't threatening her cover, he was recruiting her cooperation. Our security protocols are adequate for typical situations, Williams continued, but I sometimes worry about our preparedness for more serious threats. Having someone on staff with your evident capabilities provides a level of security that I find reassuring. The offer was implicit but clear. Williams was proposing that Margaret continue in her role as cafeteria worker while serving as an unofficial security resource for situations that exceeded the school's normal response capabilities. It would allow her to maintain her cover while acknowledging her true capabilities to someone who could make use of them. I'm not sure what capabilities you think I have, Margaret said, though her tone suggested she understood his proposal. Whatever training you've received, Williams replied diplomatically, it's clearly more comprehensive than basic self-defense classes. I'm not asking for details about your background, Mrs. Chen. I'm simply saying that if you're willing, I would appreciate knowing that someone with your skills is looking out for our students. Margaret considered the proposal carefully. Accepting would mean abandoning the complete anonymity she'd maintained for 4 years. But Williams seemed genuinely interested in student safety, rather than satisfying personal curiosity about her background. His military experience suggested he understood operational security and wouldn't compromise her position unnecessarily. I care about these students, Margaret said finally. If there's ever a situation where I can help ensure their safety, I would consider that part of my responsibility as a member of this school community. Williams smiled with evident relief. Thank you, Mrs. Chen. I hoped that would be your position. He stood and extended his hand. I want to be clear that this conversation remains between us. Your employment status, your daily responsibilities, and your privacy are unchanged. I simply wanted you to know that I recognize your value to the school extends beyond food service. Margaret shook his hand, noting the firm grip of someone who understood the significance of professional trust. I appreciate your discretion. Principal Williams. As she left his office, Margaret reflected on how completely her situation had changed in the span of a single day. The careful anonymity she'd maintained was no longer complete, but Williams' approach suggested that exposure didn't necessarily mean the end of her quiet life. Instead, it might mean the beginning of a different kind of service, one that allowed her to use her skills for protection rather than destruction. Walking back through the school corridors toward the parking lot, Margaret noticed details she'd previously observed, but not consciously acknowledged. Security camera positions, sightlines from various locations, potential choke points where hostile movement could be controlled. Her tactical awareness, suppressed for 4 years, was reasserting itself now that her cover had been partially compromised. The transition felt both uncomfortable and oddly liberating. For the first time since arriving at Lincoln High School, Margaret didn't have to completely hide her true nature. Williams' recognition meant that someone understood her actual capabilities, even if the specifics remained unspoken. Yet with that recognition came responsibility. If Williams was counting on her as an unofficial security asset, she would need to be prepared for situations that went far beyond preventing student fights. The peaceful existence she'd constructed might be evolving into something more complex, but it would remain centered on protecting others rather than eliminating threats. As Margaret reached her car in the faculty parking lot, she made a mental note to review the school's layout more systematically. If her role was expanding beyond food service, she needed to understand Lincoln High School not just as a workplace, but as a potential operational environment. The whispers started the next morning during breakfast service. Margaret noticed them immediately, small clusters of students speaking in hushed tones while glancing in her direction, conversations that stopped abruptly when she moved within hearing range. By the time lunch period arrived, the murmur of speculation had spread throughout the school with the peculiar efficiency that characterized teenage communication networks. Jenny Patterson, Margaret's usual partner at the serving station, seemed unusually fidgety as they prepared for the lunch rush. She kept stealing glances at Margaret while arranging the dessert display, clearly wanting to ask questions but uncertain how to approach the subject. Roberto Santos, typically focused entirely on his food preparation duties, appeared distracted and kept looking toward Margaret with an expression that mixed curiosity with something approaching concern. The change in atmosphere became more pronounced when Detective Tommy Rodriguez approached the serving counter during his routine lunch rounds. A compact man in his early 40s with the alert bearing of someone accustomed to assessing threats. Rodriguez had been the school's resource officer for 3 years. His interactions with Margaret had always been professionally cordial, but limited brief. Greetings during his security walks and occasional conversations about student welfare concerns. Today, however, Rodriguez lingered at Margaret's station. Longer than usual, his attention focused with the intensity of a trained investigator. "Mrs. Chen," he said, accepting the portion of the day's featured chicken parmesan, "I heard you helped break up that situation with Derek Thompson yesterday." Margaret continued serving while maintaining her standard professional demeanor. "I just helped 2 students avoid making a mistake they would have regretted," she replied, using nearly identical language to what she'd told Principal Williams. Rodriguez nodded, but his expression suggested he was evaluating more than her words. "Derek's been in trouble before for aggressive behavior. Getting through to him isn't easy, especially when he's worked up. You must have quite a way with difficult students." The comment contained an undertone that made Margaret's situational awareness spike. Rodriguez wasn't simply making conversation, he was probing, trying to understand how a cafeteria worker had successfully de-escalated a confrontation that typically would have required his intervention. "Experience helps," Margaret said carefully. "When you work around teenagers every day, you learn to recognize when emotions are running high." "I'm sure it does," Rodriguez agreed, though his tone indicated skepticism. "The thing is, I've been doing this job for 15 years, first as a patrol officer and now in school security. I know what trained conflict resolution looks like, and what you did yesterday looked like textbook professional technique." Margaret felt the familiar tightening in her chest that signaled potential exposure. Rodriguez's background in law enforcement meant he possessed the observational skills and professional network to conduct a more thorough investigation into her background than Principal Williams had attempted. If he decided to pursue his suspicions, He might uncover inconsistencies that could unravel her carefully constructed identity. "I took some classes in conflict mediation when I started working here," Margaret replied, which was another technical truth that omitted the vast majority of her actual training. The school district encourages all staff members to develop these skills. Rodriguez accepted the explanation with a neutral nod, but Margaret could sense his continued evaluation. As he moved away from the serving counter, she noticed him speaking quietly with Mrs. Rodriguez, one of the English teachers, their conversation accompanied by glances in her direction. The scrutiny intensified throughout the week. Alex Parker, the observant junior who had initially questioned Margaret about her situational awareness, began appearing at her serving station more frequently than lunch schedule typically allowed. Their conversations remained superficially casual, but Alex's questions demonstrated increasing sophistication in recognizing behavioral patterns that suggested advanced training. "Mrs. Chen," Alex said during one of these encounters, "I've been thinking about what you said about being prepared. Do you think ordinary people can develop the kind of awareness you have, or does it require special training?" The question was carefully constructed to appear academic while actually probing for information about Margaret's background. Alex's persistence suggested genuine fascination rather than suspicion, but the accumulated attention was creating exactly the kind of profile elevation that Margaret had spent 4 years avoiding. "Anyone can improve their observational skills," Margaret replied diplomatically. "It's mostly a matter of paying attention to your environment and the people around you." "But some people seem naturally better at it," Alex pressed. "Like yesterday, when that food fight almost started at table 12, you saw it developing before any of the teachers did. How did you know to look in that direction?" Margaret realized that Alex had been systematically observing her responses to various situations, cataloging behaviors that indicated capabilities beyond those of a typical school employee. The teenager's analytical approach was both impressive and concerning, suggesting a level of scrutiny that could eventually reveal patterns Margaret preferred to keep hidden. Carol Martinez, her supervisor, requested a private conversation at the end of the week. They met in Carol's small office adjacent to the main kitchen, a cramped space filled with menu planning documents, vendor catalogs, and the administrative detritus of managing food service for nearly 3,000 people daily. "Margaret," Carol began, settling into her desk chair with the weary expression of someone who had spent the day resolving equipment failures and supply shortages, "I need to ask you about something that's been brought to my attention." Margaret maintained her composed exterior while internally preparing for whatever concerns Carol had decided to address. As her direct supervisor, Carol had the authority to initiate formal inquiries into her background or performance, and any investigation at the district level would likely uncover discrepancies that could threaten her position. "Several staff members have mentioned that you handled that situation with Derek Thompson in a way that seemed unusually professional," Carol continued. "I'm not questioning your judgment or your actions, which were clearly appropriate. But some people are wondering about your background before you came to work here." The conversation Margaret had been dreading was finally happening, initiated not by administrative suspicion, but by the genuine curiosity of colleagues who had noticed that her capabilities exceeded her apparent qualifications. She recognized that her response would determine whether these inquiries remained informal or escalated to official investigation. "I've always been good at reading people and situations," Margaret replied, using her standard deflection technique. "When you've worked in customer service as long as I have, you develop instincts about when tensions are rising." Carol nodded, but her expression suggested she wasn't entirely satisfied with the explanation. "The thing is, Margaret, what people saw wasn't just good instincts. Mrs. Patterson said it looked like you had professional training in handling physical confrontations. Detective Rodriguez mentioned that your positioning and timing suggested tactical awareness." Margaret realized that her colleagues had been discussing her response with enough detail to identify specific elements that indicated advanced training. The level of scrutiny was approaching the threshold where continued deflection would become more suspicious than partial acknowledgement. "I took some self-defense classes years ago," Margaret said, expanding slightly on her previous explanations. "When you're a woman working various jobs, it seems like a reasonable precaution. Some of those classes included conflict de-escalation techniques." "I see," Carol replied, though her tone suggested she recognized the inadequacy of this explanation for what people had observed. "Margaret, you've been an exemplary employee, and I want to be clear that this conversation isn't about your job performance. But if there's additional training or experience in your background that might be relevant to school safety, it would be helpful for us to know about it." The request was diplomatically phrased, but Margaret understood its implications. Carol was asking her to voluntarily disclose capabilities that could be useful for school security purposes, while simultaneously offering reassurance that such disclosure wouldn't negatively impact her employment. "I appreciate your confidence in me," Margaret replied carefully. "If there's ever a situation where my experience might be helpful in keeping students safe, I would consider that part of my responsibility as a member of this school community." Carol smiled with evident relief. "That's exactly what I hoped you'd say." "I'm not asking for details about your background, Margaret. I'm simply saying that if you have skills that could benefit our students' safety, I want you to know that this administration values that contribution." As Margaret left Carol's office, she reflected on how her carefully maintained anonymity had been systematically eroded over the past week. Multiple colleagues had independently reached similar conclusions about her background, and their collective curiosity was creating pressure for more substantial acknowledgement of her true capabilities. The situation reached a new level of complexity when Frank Sullivan, the evening janitor, approached her during afternoon cleanup. Frank was a quiet man in his 60s, who typically worked alone and rarely engaged in extended conversations with other staff members. His decision to seek her out suggested that speculation about her background had spread beyond the day shift. "Personnel." "Mrs. Chen," Frank said, glancing around to ensure their conversation wouldn't be overheard. "I wanted to thank you for what you did with those boys yesterday." Margaret paused in her equipment cleaning routine, surprised by Frank's initiative in addressing the incident. "I just helped prevent a situation from getting worse," she replied with her standard response. Frank nodded, but his expression suggested he wanted to say more. "My grandson Derek is one of those boys," he said quietly. "He's had some troubles, made some bad choices, but he's not a bad kid, just angry about things he can't control." The revelation that Frank was Derek's grandfather added a personal dimension to the conversation that Margaret hadn't anticipated. She realized that her intervention had directly affected someone whose family member worked alongside her daily. "Derek strikes me as someone who's struggling with frustration rather than genuine malice," Margaret said diplomatically. "Sometimes young people just need adults to help them find better ways to handle difficult emotions." "That's exactly right," Frank agreed with obvious gratitude. "The thing is, Mrs. Chen, Derek told me something about how you stopped that fight. He said you moved like someone who really knew what they were doing, like you'd been trained for that kind of situation." Margaret felt another wave of exposure anxiety as she realized that even Derek had recognized capabilities that extended beyond casual intervention. The incident was being analyzed from multiple perspectives, each adding details that collectively painted a picture of someone with professional training in physical confrontation management. "I'm just glad no one was hurt," Margaret replied, attempting to redirect the conversation away from her specific techniques. Frank studied her face with the careful attention of someone who had reached his own conclusions. "Mrs. Chen, I don't know what your background is, and I'm not asking you to tell me. But I want you to know that having someone like you looking out for these kids means a lot to families like mine. The gratitude in Frank's voice was genuine, and Margaret realized that her exposure was generating appreciation rather than suspicion from people who understood its value. Rather than threatening her position, recognition of her capabilities was creating expectations that she could contribute to student safety in ways that extended beyond food service. As the week concluded, Margaret assessed her changed situation. With the analytical detachment that years of operational experience had taught her, her cover was partially compromised, but in a way that enhanced rather than threatened her position at Lincoln High School. Multiple colleagues had independently recognized her advanced capabilities, but their response had been appreciation rather than suspicion. The carefully constructed anonymity was gone, but it had been replaced by something potentially more valuable: recognition as someone whose skills could contribute to the welfare of students and staff. The question now was how to manage this evolution while maintaining enough operational security to protect the classified aspects of her background that absolutely could not be revealed. 3 weeks after the Derek Thompson incident, Margaret's new reality crystallized during what would later be remembered as the Lincoln High School crisis. It began on a Thursday morning that seemed identical to hundreds of others' clear Arizona skies, the familiar rhythm of breakfast service, and the typical energy of students beginning another day of classes. Margaret was positioned at her usual serving station, efficiently portioning scrambled eggs and turkey sausage while engaging in brief conversations with students and staff. At 10:47 a.m., during the transition period between second and third periods, the school's emergency communication system crackled to life with an announcement that changed everything. Principal Williams' voice, usually calm and measured, carried an edge of controlled urgency that immediately captured Margaret's attention. "This is a code red lockdown. All students and staff should immediately move to secure locations and await further instructions. This is not a drill. Repeat, code red lockdown. This is not a drill." Margaret's operational training engaged instantly, her mind shifting from cafeteria worker to tactical assessment mode in the space between heartbeats. Around her, kitchen staff froze momentarily before Jenny Patterson released a small cry of fear, and Roberto dropped the serving spoon he'd been holding. The code red designation indicated an active threat to student safety, most likely an armed intruder on campus. Through the serving window, Margaret could see students in the hallway responding with varying degrees of comprehension and panic. Some moved quickly toward classrooms as they'd been trained during monthly drills, while others stood confused or began running in directions that would take them away from secure areas. The scene contained the chaotic energy of people reacting to danger without clear information about its nature or location. Detective Rodriguez's voice came through the intercom system 30 seconds later, providing the crucial details that Margaret's training required for tactical planning. Armed individual reported in the main building near the administrative offices. All personnel maintain lockdown positions until further notice. Margaret's mind immediately began calculating distances, access routes, and response options. The main building housed the principal's office, where Williams would be coordinating the emergency response, the guidance counseling offices where staff members might be trapped, and multiple classrooms containing students who would be following lockdown protocols. An armed intruder in that location had access to the school's most populated areas during class transition times. "What do we do?" Jenny whispered, her voice tight with fear. The kitchen staff had gathered near the main prep counter, looking to Margaret, with expressions that suggested they recognized her as someone who might have answers in a crisis situation. "We secure this area first," Margaret replied, her voice carrying the calm authority that years of high-pressure situations had taught her. "Roberto, help me move the serving counter to block the main entrance. Jenny, call the office and let them know our status, then turn off all the lights in here." As her colleagues moved to follow her instructions, Margaret conducted a rapid assessment of the cafeteria's tactical situation. The kitchen area offered multiple advantages: reinforced doors that could be secured, limited access points that could be controlled, and clear sightlines to potential approach routes. More importantly, the serving window provided observation of the main corridor that connected the cafeteria to the administrative building where the threat was located. Through that window, Margaret could see students who had been caught in the hallway during the lockdown announcement. Most had found classroom doors to shelter behind, but she spotted 3 freshman students huddled near the vending machines approximately 50 yards from the cafeteria entrance. Their position offered no real protection, and their obvious fear suggested they didn't understand how to reach a secure location. Margaret's tactical training identified this as a classic operational decision point. She could maintain her cover by remaining in the secured kitchen area and waiting for law enforcement response, or she could acknowledge her true capabilities and take action to protect students who were currently vulnerable to the reported threat. The decision crystallized when she heard the distinctive sound of rapid footsteps in the main corridor, moving in the direction of the students near the vending machines. Through the serving window, she could see a figure in dark clothing carrying what appeared to be a rifle, advancing with the purposeful movement of someone who knew the building layout and had specific objectives. "Stay here and keep the doors secured," Margaret told her kitchen colleagues, her voice calm but carrying unmistakable authority. "If anyone asks, I went to check on students in the dining area." Before Roberto or Jenny could respond, Margaret had moved through the kitchen door that led directly into the main cafeteria space. Her movements reflected 15 years of tactical training as she advanced along the wall that would provide cover while allowing her to observe the corridor. Situation. Every step was calculated to minimize her visibility while positioning her for optimal response to the developing threat. The 3 freshman students had pressed themselves against the vending machines, clearly visible to anyone approaching from the direction of the administrative building. The armed figure was approximately 30 yards away and closing distance. With methodical precision that suggested military or law enforcement training, Margaret's assessment indicated she had perhaps 20 seconds before the threat reached a position where the students would be in immediate danger. Margaret's mind shifted into the operational mode that had defined her classified career. Distance calculations became automatic, environmental factors registered with enhanced clarity, and potential response options arranged themselves in order of tactical viability. The 15 years since her official retirement from active duty vanished as instincts honed in hostile environments reasserted complete control. She moved along the cafeteria wall with the fluid precision that had once made her legendary among special operations communities. Each step placed her closer to an optimal firing position while maintaining concealment from the approaching threat. Her breathing remained controlled, her heart rate steady, and her focus absolute. The armed intruder had reached a position where the 3 students were clearly visible and within range. Margaret could see his weapon rising toward firing position, and her tactical training calculated that intervention was required within the next 3 to 5 seconds to prevent casualties. Margaret stepped into the corridor. "Federal agent," she called out in the command voice that had once directed operations in environments where hesitation meant death. "Drop your weapon and step away from the students." The figure turned toward her, weapon swinging in her direction with trained precision that confirmed Margaret's assessment of professional background. In the split second of visual contact, she processed critical details, body armor, tactical equipment, and movement patterns that suggested law enforcement or military training comparable to her own. What happened next occurred in the compressed time frame, where advanced training made superhuman performance possible. The armed figure's weapon continued its arc toward Margaret's position while she simultaneously assessed trajectory, calculated optimal response, and executed the muscle memory that had once made her the most effective sniper in classified operations. Margaret's movement was fluid and precise, a tactical advance that brought her within optimal range while maintaining the angular advantage that her training required. Her positioning created a clear line of engagement while ensuring that the 3 students remained outside any potential crossfire zone. "Last warning," Margaret said, her voice carrying the absolute authority of someone who had made life-and-death decisions in circumstances far more complex than a school hallway. "Drop the weapon now." The armed figure's response confirmed Margaret's tactical assessment. Instead of complying, he adjusted his stance in a way that indicated preparation for sustained engagement. His weapon positioning suggested he had identified Margaret as a significant threat requiring immediate neutralization. Margaret's response drew on 15 years of specialized training and operational experience that had never appeared in any official military record. Her movement was economical and decisive, closing the distance while maintaining tactical advantage. The engagement lasted less than 4 seconds and concluded with the armed intruder disarmed and secured using techniques that Detective Rodriguez would later describe as textbook professional restraint. The 3 freshman students remained pressed against the vending machines, staring at Margaret with expressions of shock and confusion. Around them, the school's lockdown procedures continued as teachers and staff maintained secure positions while waiting for official all-clear notifications. "Stay exactly where you are," Margaret told the students, her voice returning to the calm tone they associated with the cafeteria lady who always remembered their lunch preferences. "Everything is under control now." Detective Rodriguez arrived at the scene 6 minutes later, leading a response team that included Principal Williams and 2 Phoenix Police Department officers. Their expressions shifted from tactical alertness to confusion as they processed the scene. An armed intruder secured with professional restraint techniques, 3 unharmed students, and Margaret Chen standing calmly beside the neutralized threat. "Mrs. Chen," Rodriguez said slowly, his voice carrying the careful tone of someone trying to understand an impossible situation. "What exactly happened here?" Margaret looked around at the assembled response team, recognizing that her carefully maintained cover had been completely destroyed by the past few minutes. Every person present had witnessed capabilities that could not be explained by food, service experience, or basic self-defense training. "I saw students in danger and took appropriate action," she replied simply. Principal Williams stepped forward, his expression mixing relief with the dawning recognition that his suspicions about Margaret's background had been dramatically understated. "Mrs. Chen, that was extraordinary work. I think we need to have a more comprehensive conversation about your background." Before Margaret could respond, Captain Lisa Thompson arrived on the scene. Thompson commanded the Phoenix Police Department's Special Operations Division and had been notified when the school reported an armed intruder incident. Her assessment of the situation was immediate and professional, focusing on the precise restraint techniques that had been used to secure the threat. "Whoever handled this situation has advanced tactical training," Thompson announced to the assembled group. "This level of precision doesn't come from civilian self-defense courses." Margaret found herself the center of attention from law enforcement professionals who were trying to reconcile the cafeteria worker they knew with the tactical capabilities they had just witnessed. The moment she had been avoiding for 4 years had finally arrived, and there was no possibility of maintaining her constructed identity. "I have some relevant experience," Margaret said carefully, using the understated language that operational personnel employed when discussing classified backgrounds. Captain Thompson studied Margaret with the analytical attention of someone who recognized advanced training when she encountered it. "Ma'am, would you be willing to speak with me privately about your background? What I observed here suggests capabilities that might be valuable for our ongoing security planning." Over the next hour, as the school returned to normal operations and the crisis response concluded, Margaret found herself in Principal Williams' office with Captain Thompson, Detective Rodriguez, and a representative from the district security office. The conversation that followed would fundamentally change her role at Lincoln High School. "Mrs. Chen," Captain Thompson began, "your response to today's situation demonstrated tactical awareness and physical capabilities that suggest extensive professional training. I'm not asking you to compromise any classified information, but I think it would be beneficial for everyone if we understood the scope of your background." Margaret recognized that continued deflection was no longer viable. Her actions during the crisis had revealed capabilities that could only be explained by acknowledging at least some aspects of her true background. "I served in the military for 15 years, she said finally. "Specialized operations that required particular skills. When I left service, I chose civilian work that would allow me to use those skills for protection rather than elimination." The admission represented a fundamental shift in how Margaret would exist at Lincoln High School. Captain Thompson's expression indicated professional recognition and respect, while Principal Williams' face showed relief that his instincts about her capabilities had been correct. "Ma'am," Thompson said, "would you be interested in consulting with our department on school security protocols? Your insights could be valuable for developing response procedures that protect students more effectively." Detective Rodriguez, who had spent weeks trying to understand Margaret's background, finally spoke. "Mrs. Chen, I owe you an apology. I knew you had training, but I never imagined the level of expertise you were bringing to this school every day." Margaret looked around the room at people who now understood that the quiet cafeteria worker possessed capabilities that extended far beyond food service. The anonymity she had carefully maintained was gone, but it had been replaced by recognition and respect from professionals who understood the value of her skills. "I came here because I wanted to serve without the complexities of my previous career," Margaret said. "But if my experience can help protect these students, I'm willing to expand that service." Principal Williams smiled with evident relief and gratitude. "Mrs. Chen, I think it's time we discussed a more formal role that acknowledges all of your capabilities, while maintaining your connection to our school community." 6 months later, Margaret stood in Lincoln High School's main office wearing a badge that identified her as Director of Security Operations, a newly created position that acknowledged her unique qualifications while allowing her to maintain her connection to the students and staff she had come to care about. The cafeteria lady had evolved into something more comprehensive, but the core mission remained unchanged: protecting young people who deserve safe environments for learning and growth. Alex Parker, now a senior, stopped by her office regularly to discuss college plans and career options. Their conversations had evolved from curious questions about Margaret's awareness to serious discussions about public service and the different ways people could contribute to their communities. "Mrs. Chen," Alex said during one of these visits, "do you ever miss your old career?" Margaret considered the question while looking through her office window at students heading to lunch in the cafeteria where she had once served meals. "I miss the clarity of purpose," she replied. "But I've discovered that protecting people can take many forms, and some of the most important work happens in places where no one expects to find it." Frank Sullivan, Derek's grandfather, had become one of Margaret's strongest supporters in her new role. Derek himself had transformed from an angry teenager into a thoughtful young man who was considering military service after graduation. Inspired partly by knowing that someone with Margaret's background had chosen to dedicate her skills to protecting others, the transition from hidden cafeteria worker to acknowledged security professional had been complex, but Margaret discovered that her new role allowed her to use her training in ways that aligned with her desire to protect rather than eliminate threats. Lincoln High School had become safer because someone had recognized that extraordinary capabilities were sometimes hidden in ordinary roles. Captain Thompson had kept her promise about consulting opportunities, and Margaret now worked with multiple school districts to develop security protocols that acknowledged both the realities of modern threats and the importance of maintaining educational environments that fostered learning rather than fear. As Margaret finished her evening security rounds and prepared to leave the school, she reflected on how completely her life had changed since the day Detective Rodriguez first questioned her. Intervention in a student confrontation. The careful anonymity was gone, but it had been replaced by purposeful recognition that allowed her to serve in ways that honored both her specialized training and her commitment to protecting others. The tattoo hidden beneath her collar, a small eagle that had once identified her as part of classified operations, now represented something different, proof that highly trained individuals could choose service over personal advancement, protection over destruction, and that sometimes the most valuable contributions came from people whose backgrounds nobody suspected. Margaret Chen was no longer just the cafeteria lady, but she remained committed to the same fundamental mission, ensuring that young people could learn and grow in environments where their safety was protected by those with the skills and dedication to provide it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.